I never thought a simple camping trip with my closest friends could turn into the most horrifying experience of my life. There were 4 of us: me, Sarah, Dan, and Melissa. We had been planning the trip for weeks, excited to escape the chaos of the city for a weekend in the serene wilderness. We found a secluded spot deep in the woods, miles from the nearest road. It was perfect, quiet, peaceful, and far from the reach of cell signals. We pitched our tents near a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, the thick canopy casting long shadows as the sun began to set. We spent the evening laughing around a campfire, roasting marshmallows, and sharing ghost stories. It was around midnight when things started to feel off. The fire was dying down, and we were all settling in when we heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping. It seemed to be coming from the trees, distant yet distinct. We brushed it off as an animal, but something about it felt unnatural, almost deliberate. "Probably just a woodpecker," Dan said, though his voice wavered. None of us responded. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps. They weren't heavy, but they were close, circling our campsite. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I peeked out of my tent, expecting to see a deer or maybe a curious camper. Instead, I saw nothing. The forest was eerily still, the kind of silence that feels oppressive. The next morning, we found strange symbols carved into the trees around our campsite. They looked old, weathered, but none of us had noticed them the day before. "Probably just some pranksters," Melissa said, but her face betrayed her unease. That evening, the tapping returned, louder this time. It seemed to come from all directions, echoing through the forest. Sarah screamed when she found a small, crudely carved wooden figure lying near the fire. It looked like a person, but its head was missing. "We should leave," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But Dan insisted we stay. "We can't let some weird noises ruin our trip," he argued. That night, the forest came alive. Shadows danced between the trees, just beyond the firelight. We could hear whispers, faint and indistinct, carried on the wind. Every so often, I thought I saw something. A figure impossibly tall and thin, standing just at the edge of the clearing. But when I looked directly, it was gone. Around 3 a.m., Melissa's scream shattered the night. We rushed out of our tents to find her standing in the middle of the clearing, shaking. "Something was in my tent," she stammered, tears streaming down her face. "It touched me." We packed up immediately, adrenaline pushing us to work faster than I thought possible. But as we started hiking back to the car, the woods seemed different. The trail we had followed in was gone, replaced by dense underbrush. Every direction we turned felt wrong, unfamiliar. Dan tried using his compass, but the needle spun erratically, as though it couldn't decide which way was north. The tapping followed us, closer now, interspersed with the occasional low growl. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. After what felt like hours of aimless wandering, we stumbled into a clearing and froze. It was our campsite. Somehow, no matter how far we walked, the forest had brought us back. We didn't sleep that night, huddled together around the dying embers of the fire. By morning, Sarah was gone. No one had heard her leave, and her things were still in her tent. We searched for hours, screaming her name until our voices were hoarse, but there was no sign of her. We reached the road just as the sun was setting, a dull orange glow casting long shadows across the asphalt. My legs felt like jelly, and my breath came in ragged gasps. The 3 of us, me, Dan, and Melissa, stood there, staring at the emptiness before us, unsure of what to do. None of us said it, but we were all thinking the same thing. What now? "Let's just get back to the car," Melissa whispered, her voice trembling. "We'll call for help once we're out of here." Dan nodded, his face pale and drawn. He pulled out the map, his hands shaking, and we started walking. But the road felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but something about the way the trees leaned inward, casting jagged shadows across the pavement, made my skin crawl. It was as if the forest was still with us, refusing to let us go. After what felt like hours, we came across a car parked on the side of the road. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As we got closer, my stomach dropped. It wasn't our car. It was old, rusted, and covered in moss, as though it had been there for years. The windows were fogged up, but inside, I could make out shapes, 4 figures sitting unnaturally still. "Don't look," Dan muttered, grabbing my arm and pulling me away. Melissa froze, her eyes wide, her lips moving silently as she stared at the car. "Melissa!" Dan snapped, shaking her. "Come on, we have to go." She blinked, tearing her gaze away, and we kept walking. But the unease only grew. The road stretched on endlessly, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. I could have sworn we passed the same rusted road sign 3 times, its lettering faded and unreadable. By the time night fell, we were still walking. Our flashlights barely pierced the darkness, their beams swallowed up by the thick blackness of the woods. The tapping returned, faint at first but growing louder, closer. It echoed through the trees, each sharp knock sending a jolt of terror through me. Then we heard Sarah's voice. "Help! Please, help me!" It was distant, coming from somewhere deep in the forest. Melissa screamed, running toward the sound, but Dan grabbed her before she got far. "It's not her!" he shouted, his voice breaking. "It's not her!" Melissa struggled, tears streaming down her face. "We can't just leave her," she sobbed. "What if she's alive?" Dan held firm, his grip like iron. "That's not her," he repeated, his eyes darting nervously around the darkened trees. "It's something else." The voice came again, closer this time. "Help me, please. I'm hurt." And then we saw her, Sarah. She stepped out from the shadows, her clothes torn and dirty, her face pale. "I thought you left me," she said, her voice trembling. "I've been trying to find you." Melissa broke free and ran to her, hugging her tightly. But something was wrong. Sarah's eyes didn't look right. Too dark, too empty. Her movements were stiff, unnatural, as if she wasn't used to being in her own skin. "Sarah?" I asked hesitantly, my voice shaking. She turned to me, smiling faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It's okay now," she said. "We can go home." Dan grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "That's not Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "We need to run." Before I could react, Sarah, or whatever it was, turned her head toward us, her neck bending at an impossible angle. Her smile stretched wider, revealing rows of teeth that were too sharp, too many. "Why are you leaving?" she asked, her voice distorted, layered with something deeper, something inhuman. We ran. The forest seemed alive, the trees twisting and shifting to block our path. The tapping turned into pounding, a relentless, deafening drumbeat that seemed to come from everywhere. The whispers were back, louder now, overlapping and frantic, like a chorus of voices crying out in pain. We stumbled onto the road again, and this time our car was there. Without thinking, we piled in, Dan fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, and we sped off, the tires screeching as we left the woods behind. But as we drove, the unease didn't leave us. The road stretched on endlessly, the scenery repeating like a broken loop. The tapping started again, faint but unmistakable, coming from the roof of the car. Melissa screamed, pointing at the rearview mirror. I turned and saw them, shadows tall and thin, running alongside the car, their movements jerky and unnatural. Their hollow eyes stared at us, unblinking, as they kept pace no matter how fast we drove. Dan pressed the gas pedal to the floor, and finally the shadows disappeared. We emerged from the woods onto a highway, the bright lights of a gas station in the distance. We stopped there, shaking and exhausted, but when we tried to tell the attendant what happened, he just gave us a strange look. "There aren't any woods like that around here," he said. "That road's been closed for years." We left in silence, too scared to argue. None of us ever spoke about the trip again, and we never went camping after that. But sometimes, late at night, I hear tapping outside my window. It's faint, almost imperceptible, but it's there. And I know the woods aren't done with us yet. camping had always been my escape. A few nights under the stars, away from the buzz of city life, worked wonders for my mental health. So when my friend Alex bailed on our trip last minute, I decided to go solo. I mean, how dangerous could a weekend in the wilderness really be? I chose a secluded spot deep in the forest, far from the overcrowded campsites. The trail was rugged, but the promise of solitude kept me going. By late afternoon, I found the perfect clearing, a small meadow surrounded by towering pines. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest transformed. Shadows stretched and merged, and the sounds of distant animals became unnervingly close. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and tried to ignore the creeping unease that seemed to settle with the night. It started subtly. Around midnight, as I sat by the dwindling fire, I heard faint whispers. I froze, straining my ears. They were soft, almost indistinct, like a conversation just out of reach. The logical part of my brain dismissed it as the wind. But then, the whispers seemed to grow louder, more deliberate. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The whispers stopped. The forest fell silent. Even the chirping crickets seemed to vanish. I laughed nervously, chalking it up to my imagination, and crawled into my tent. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt watched. When I did drift off, I had vivid nightmares of shadowy figures circling my campsite, their faces hidden but their presence oppressive. I woke up drenched in sweat multiple times, convinced I wasn't alone. Morning brought a sense of relief, but my unease lingered. I debated packing up and leaving, but my stubbornness got the better of me. Just one more night, I told myself. The day passed uneventfully. I hiked, fished in a nearby stream, and tried to shake off the fear from the night before. By evening, I had almost convinced myself it had all been in my head. But as the sun set, the whispers returned. This time, they were closer. I couldn't tell what they were saying, but the tone was unsettling, mocking, almost playful. Grabbing my flashlight, I scanned the forest, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. "Who's out there?" I yelled, my voice echoing through the trees. The whispers stopped again, but this time, they were replaced by a sound that sent a chill down my spine. A soft, rhythmic tapping. It seemed to come from all directions at once, as if the forest itself was alive and mocking me. Panicking, I threw more wood onto the fire, desperate to keep the darkness at bay. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it sounded like someone drumming their fingers on the tent fabric. I spun around, my flashlight trembling in my hand, and finally saw it, just outside the ring of light cast by the fire. A figure stood motionless, its outline barely distinguishable against the shadows. It was tall, unnaturally so, with long, spindly arms that dangled at its sides. Its head tilted as if observing me, and though I couldn't see its face, I felt its gaze pierce through me. "Go away!" I screamed, throwing a burning stick in its direction. The figure didn't move, but the whispers erupted again, this time surrounding me in a cacophony of overlapping voices. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I grabbed my bag, doused the fire, and bolted down the trail, the voices following me, growing louder and more distorted. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop until I reached my car. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Standing at the edge of the forest, illuminated by my taillights, was the figure. It didn't chase me, it didn't need to. The whispers were already inside my head, and they haven't stopped since. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from the forest, only pulling into the parking lot of a gas station when my trembling hands could barely grip the steering wheel. The fluorescent lights were a welcome contrast to the oppressive darkness I had left behind. I sat there, staring into the night, trying to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe my mind had played tricks on me. But no amount of logic could explain the whispers that still echoed faintly in my ears. I splashed cold water on my face in the station bathroom, forcing myself to take deep breaths. The attendant, An older man with a kind but weathered face noticed my disheveled state. "You all right, son?" he asked. I hesitated. "How do you explain something you don't even understand?" "Rough night camping," I muttered. His expression darkened. "You weren't out near the deep woods, were you?" My heart sank. "Yeah." "Why?" He leaned in, lowering his voice as if the walls themselves were listening. "People around here don't camp there anymore. Too many stories. People hearing things, seeing things." He shook his head and sighed. "Whatever's out there, it's best left alone." I've always loved camping. Being surrounded by the calm of nature, disconnected from the noise of everyday life. This particular trip was supposed to be like the others, a peaceful weekend in the wilderness. But it wasn't. It was something I'll never forget, no matter how hard I try. My friend Marcus and I decided to camp in a remote spot deep in the Appalachians. It was mid-autumn, and the forest was alive with the sound of crunching leaves beneath our boots and the occasional rustle of squirrels preparing for winter. We arrived at a clearing just before dusk and set up camp. Marcus built a fire while I pitched the tent. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a chill swept through the air. We sat by the fire, laughing, telling stories, and enjoying the isolation. Around 10 p.m., we heard it, the faint, rhythmic clink of metal against metal. It was distant at first, blending with the natural sounds of the forest, but as the hours passed, it grew louder. "What is that?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shrugged, trying to play it off as some animal. But deep down, I felt it too, an unease I couldn't shake. The sound stopped around midnight, and we decided to call it a night. I crawled into my sleeping bag, letting the warmth and the rhythm of the forest lull me to sleep. I woke to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was Marcus, maybe going to relieve himself. But when I looked over, I saw him still lying in his bag, his chest rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. The footsteps were outside, circling the tent, deliberate and heavy. My heart pounded as I gripped the handle of the camping knife I'd packed, straining to hear. Then came the light, a soft, flickering glow just outside the tent wall. It danced like firelight but moved unnaturally, gliding from one side of the tent to the other. Marcus woke up, his eyes wide with confusion as he whispered, "What's that?" "I don't know," I muttered, my voice trembling. We sat frozen, watching the light pause and then move again, circling us. Marcus grabbed a flashlight, unzipped the tent, and stepped outside. "Hello?" he called into the dark. The light stopped. It hovered about 20 feet away, illuminating a figure, a man holding a lantern. His face was obscured by the shadows, but I could make out the shape of a wide-brimmed hat and a long coat. He didn't move or respond, just stood there, the lantern swaying gently in his hand. Marcus turned to me, his face pale. "Let's pack up and go." We scrambled to dismantle the tent, keeping an eye on the figure. As we worked, the man took a step forward, then another. The lantern's glow revealed his face, a gaunt, hollow visage with empty black eyes that seemed to absorb the light. He didn't blink or speak, just stared. We abandoned the tent and ran, clutching only our backpacks. The sound of the lantern's glass rattling followed us, echoing through the woods. No matter how far or fast we ran, the light never faded. It was always there, just out of reach, swaying rhythmically. We finally reached the car, breathless and panicked. As I fumbled with the keys, Marcus froze, his eyes locked on the edge of the tree line. The figure stood there, lantern raised. For a moment, I thought he'd come closer, but instead, he turned and disappeared into the darkness, the light fading with him. We drove away in silence, neither of us daring to speak. When we reached the nearest town, we pulled into a diner, desperate for the company of other people. An old man sitting at the counter overheard us recounting the night to the waitress. "You boys were up in Black Hollow, weren't you?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "They say a lantern man haunts those woods. Lost his family in a fire years ago and wanders looking for them. We didn't stay to hear the rest. I haven't been camping since, and Marcus refuses to talk about it. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see that lanterns glow and hear the soft clink of glass against metal.